Welcome to the Tank podcast. This week's episode features a conversation between literary translators Anton and Bryan Karetnyk, in which they discuss their respective recent works Cursed-bunny-by-bora-chung and Deceit-by-yuri-felsen. Along the way, the pair touch on the difference between working with living and long-dead authors, the importance of staying difficult, and translation as a form of dishonesty.
Very nice to meet you. I read your book, your translation, Deceit, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank
I thought, maybe we can start off by asking like how we, translated, how we found our authors and how we found the books that we translate. So,
a good way to say it.
Yeah, I feel like for your book, it's going to be especially interesting because I've never heard of this author. And it's one of those authors where you've never heard of, and then you read them and you're like, oh, how could I have never heard of this author? And, but I've never heard of this author. So I was really wondering how you discovered the author and what was like your process in trying to convince publishers to publish him in translation, despite the fact that he is not alive, he is, not a contemporary, and no one seems to remember him.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a really interesting question, Anton. Thank you. I'm always reminded when I did one of my very first books, my really wonderful editor, Gesche Ibsen, she said to me that there's nothing more difficult in publishing than launching a dead author. And I think this really sort of spoke to my experience with Felsen. I mean, I first came across his name about 9 years ago when I was doing another book that I was working on. So I'd been commissioned to do an anthology of Russian emigre short fiction for Penguin. So looking at all these Russian authors who fled Russia after the revolution, went and settled some in China, some in the Near East, some in Europe, some in America. And I think if you know about Russian diaspora, if you know anything about Russian diaspora, you're probably going to know that they were always at each other's throats. They always hated each other. They were always writing these really harsh, critical invectives against one another. And all of a sudden I came across Yuri-Felsen's name, and somehow he seemed to, or sort of critical opinion seemed to coalesce around him. I've got everyone on completely differing sides of the political spectrum, the literary spectrum, all sort of coalesced around him saying what a great author he was. So I investigated, I started reading his literature, I fell in love with it. And yeah, that was 9 years ago, and it took me a long time to sort of approach different publishers, find the right publisher for it, because as you say, so you get all sorts of knockbacks because he's not well known enough, he's not commercial, whatever that means, he's not a lot of the things that publishers would more typically look for. But it was really interesting because it took essentially for Prototype, my wonderful English publishers, to be launched in 2018, and they were launched specifically with this idea of looking at the sort of literature that would otherwise fall through the cracks in mainstream publishing, to really take a chance on this work. And yeah, eventually, after a lot of hoops after that, we got around to doing it. But I mean, as you can tell from the way, it's an incredibly dense text. It's an incredibly difficult word to translate. So I feel like I've been living with this book for the best part of, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, at least in terms of translating it. So yeah. But I mean, going back to your question about the reason that it's not particularly known, I mean, Felsen himself was a Russian emigre. He was banned from publication in Russia throughout the 20th century. He perished in Auschwitz, after which his archive was completely lost. So, I mean, he kind of fell into oblivion, essentially, in the rest of the 20th century. So, I mean, he's not really known in Russia either, which was another stumbling point for publishers, because nobody had heard of this guy. But then somehow it sort of fell to me. I felt such an affinity with the author when I read it. I just sort of fell in love with him, his story, his writing. Sort of, I hadn't really felt with a lot of, well, not to that extent, at least, with other works that I've translated over the years. So yeah, it's been an incredibly intense personal sort of experience working on this book. Yeah. How about you? So you're, I've got it here for anyone who's looking, the wonderful, the wonderful Cursed-bunny-by-bora-chung. I mean, first thing first to say to you, I mean, absolutely congratulations on the huge success you've had with the International Booker shortlisting. You had a double one as well, so congratulations for that. I mean, brilliant, and it's been getting a lot of amazing press everywhere, as from what I can see. So I mean, huge kudos to you for doing that. So yeah, how did you come across Cursed Bunny, and how did you come across Bora-chung?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for your remarks. Yeah. I just wanted to slip in that Bora-chung's favorite writers are Russian. She studied Russian literature. She has a PhD in Slavic literature, and I asked her, like, so whose style influenced you the most? And she said, oh, probably the Russian formalists. There was apparently like a group of Soviet writers who were all completely wild in their thinking, and they were all like executed by the regime. And she said that, and I think Russian readers and readers who are from like the former Eastern Bloc, when they read Bora, they're like, oh yeah, I see where this literature comes from, and that response is always very gratifying to her. Yeah, famously, I discovered quote unquote Bora at a book fair because I was actually looking for a work of Korean speculative fiction to translate, and an author that I've translated before, John Same had tweeted that they were going to be helping out at a booth, at a science fiction publisher's booth. So I'm like, oh, I'm just going to go to this book fair and hang out with John Same. I'm not going to help them sell books, but but I will hang out with them. And I go to the booth. It's a science fiction publisher called Arzak. John Same is kind of like busy with customers over there. And there's this other lady standing here who is also selling books. And every time I touch a book, the lady would go, oh, that book is so awesome. Like, that book's so fun. Like, blah, 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 blah. And then it kind of got a little annoying at one point. And then when I touched this other book, she suddenly falls silent. So I'm like, oh, I guess this book kind of sucks. And I pick it up. And I just like read one sentence from it. And I'm like, wow, this writer can really write. And I went to like one of the stories. It was called The Head, and I started reading it, and I'm like, oh my god, there's a head in a toilet. I have to translate this. And so I asked the lady, like, oh, I would like to. So I'm a translator. I know you have no idea who I am, but I am a translator. Like, who is the author of this book? And then she goes, I'm the author of this book. And to this day, I make fun of her for not selling her own book to me. Because she just like fell silent when I touched her book. So yeah, and then and they were like understandably skeptical. They were like, who is this person who walks up to a booth, in a book fair and demands translation rights? But luckily, again, John Same was there with me. So I grabbed John Same and I was like, tell them what a great translator I am and that I'm not a fraud and I can actually get this book published. And John Same was like, yeah, he's whatever. And so I owe John Same like everything that happened afterwards. But yeah, I was determined to translate a work of speculative fiction because the translation, first of all, there was almost nothing science fiction or fantasy or horror being translated from Korean into English. Korean literature in translation was being it was like mostly cisgender men writing about the student protests that they would go to when they were in their 20s. And I'm like, it's the same book over and over again, the same authors being promoted over and over again. And, you'd have authors like, I don't know, Karetnyk, and I'm like, who at least has like a touch of genre in her works, although like I feel like they're kind of lightweight when it comes to the genre element. And so I wanted something that was like unabashedly genre, unabashedly science fiction, because that's the kind of work that I like to read. And also the translation collective that I was part of, Smoking Tigers, importantly, Sophie Bowman and Sung Ryu and Victoria Cottle, like there were many translators who were also working on speculative fiction before me, before I was. And I just loved like reading their work in workshops. And Sophie Bowman got I'm Waiting for You, this book by Kim Boyoung, all the way to as a finalist for Penn Presents. And that was like a really inspirational moment for all the translators who were interested in speculative fiction. And so I was kind of like determined to find a book that I wanted to push. And Cursed Bunny, which had been published, I believe, 2 or 3 years before I picked it up, and it had not made a splash. No one knew about it. Like no one knew who Bora-chung was. And now it's like to the point where when it got shortlisted, there was a Korean newspaper reporter who said that, oh, Bora-chung, unknown Korean writer, gets shortlisted for Booker Prize. And I was like, she's the president of the Science Fiction Writers Union of Korea. Like, as I don't know how more known you can get in that genre. So yeah, it was very important for me to that this is the kind of work that I wanted to push. And also I'm very, very grateful to Onford Star for like taking a chance on it. And I think Onford Star was very determined to kind of because they had done a lot of like older classical Korean like modern classics by Korean writers, mostly writers who are not alive. And they really wanted to kind of pivot to the contemporary, and like, wow, boy, did they pivot to the contemporary. They went like 180 degrees the other direction. And so, yeah, it was like, that part of translation is always like the part that people don't really talk about, like how we get people to how we convince publishers to even like look at our works. And that was what made me really curious about it.
There's so much swagger, there's so much branding, there's so much work that you have to do as a translator putting into that. I mean, yeah, it's sort of never ending. And even then, you never know if it's going to pay off. And it's so hit or miss, like whether or not a book lands, whether or not it succeeds. But no, I mean, you've done such a fantastic job with this. I mean, I think one thing that I really loved about Cursed Bunny is when you talk about it being speculative fiction, which it is, but I think just in terms of what really impressed me, the way that Bora-chung, she sort of mixes so many different genres within that in a sort of like really imperceptible way. I mean, you have sort of elements of science fiction, you've got elements of gothic, you've got elements of horror, you've got elements of folklore, you've got all these other elements sort of interspersed through it, but in a really sort of, how can I say, like in a really sort of almost a holistic way. And it's really refreshing to sort of read something like that. It's really exciting as well. I remember, I mean, particularly, I think, which is the last story in the collection? It's called, is it The Reunion? Is that the one that I'm thinking of? Yeah. There were 2 moments in that where I just sort of had to put the book down because I was, when the perspective just completely shifts about how you're reading the story. And I mean, that's just it's such a rare but such a wonderful experience to have as a reader. And yeah, I really loved that part of it. And there's so much in it as well that, at least for me, coming from a sort of more Western perspective, it seems there's a lot of it that seems so fresh as well. I mean, particularly the whole sort of, what I saw as being you don't have this sort of, well, you might get more in sort of Western speculative fiction, still this sort of a very sort of Christian dominated idea of sort of like good and evil, or all these sort of things. You have much more sort of nuance. It seems to me almost like a sort of Buddhist fatality going through a lot of the sort of the underpinning through it. It's just so refreshing and so really, really interesting. So, I mean, fantastic work.
Thank you so much. It is quite like, I think the most interesting part of translating it, like actually translating it, was the different voices and how to get each story just right. Some stories are more humorous than others. Some stories are more horrific than others, and there's more irony in some others. And I did want to ask you about the language, how you triangulated the voice for Deceit, because when I was reading it, and as I was getting into like the themes, I thought like, oh, it's very entertaining for me as a reader to read, but as a translator, I would have been like, how am I going to do all these layers? Because it was not published in contemporary times, but you don't want to get the language like too. So you don't want to get the language that's too contemporary because that would just sound just weird and anachronistic. And yet you don't want it to sound like a 19th century work because the thing about this book is that it's very modern. It's very just contemporary. And if you told me that the author is still alive, and I checked to see actually if the author is still alive, because it's just so it's still so fresh, and it does things that it has a kind of like immediacy and freshness that we don't really associate even with a lot of early 20th century authors. There's something just very contemporary about it. At the same time, it is not contemporary, and also there are these because its title is deceit and it has to do with deceit, that it kind of this may be getting into a more complicated question, but I was kind of like interested in what your take was in terms of it as like a metaphor even for not just literature but for translated literature, because we know like the author is an emigre and the character is also displaced. And so he lives in a state of translation, both author and the main character. And they and there's a lot of deceit that goes into translation. Like you kind of are fooling readers into thinking that you're the author. and this idea that I feel like he's also kind of deceiving himself into being seduced by this lady, because I feel like he just wants to be seduced and he wants to feel something, and so he's kind of like giving into that deceit and creating a kind of deceit for himself. And I think this is also our experience of reading literature, especially translated literature, where we kind of like, I want to read a really fresh, amazing piece of work that I never would have imagined until someone translated it. I mean, I think that's a huge appeal of what translated literature is, in that it's so surprising. And so I know my question is all over the place, but what it comes down to is, how did you decide on the voice for this book? Because I just found the voice so compelling, it was just so propulsive, and yet it has so many layers. So if you reread it, it has like, oh, there's another layer and another layer. Like, how did you get to that?
I don't know how you've been going to start to answer that, but that's a perfect question. Thank you, Anton, and thank you for those really lovely comments about it. It's difficult because you're absolutely right. There are all these layers of deceit kind of announced by the title that are at play at the same time, and you're absolutely right. The narrator, he is almost like a translator, or kind of like a failing translator, or a really struggling translator, because he's trying to sort of interpret the world around him and really failing to. And there's this sort of element, you have to try and capture that in the language, because on the one hand, he's writing something down that he thinks might be read one day, because he kind of hopes to give the diary to the object of his love. So you kind of know that you're getting a sort of one version of reality, but then it's those sort of cracks in it where you can glimpse what might be the real reality lying beneath it. And then, you've got all these other themes of displacement, and then this question of language. I mean, you've got sort of Russian mingling with French in the original quite a lot, and then in the English, I try to maintain that. In terms of the language, I mean, in terms of capturing the voice, there are a couple of things, because I mostly work on dead authors, which is another interesting thing that maybe we can talk about later, because you sort of work with more contemporary authors or living authors, and I've worked with dead authors mostly. I think there are very basic technical things, like, for instance, like the boring stuff. Like, I probably wouldn't use any words or phrases that sort of come into the language later than, say, 1950, because otherwise, you're right, that just sounds really anachronistic. There are sort of basic sort of tricks of the trade that I use in order to capture that. But I think for this, it's much more about the rhythm, it's much more about the cadence, it's much more in sort of preserving this sort of train of thought and trying to make it persuasive. Because I think with Felsen, one of the trickiest things he does, I mean, you've seen yourself, the sentences are sort of usually about a paragraph long or a page long, or sometimes even more than that, and they sort of go through about 20 different clauses and all these different permutations, and what starts off as being a really simple observation is suddenly transformed into this almost sort of miniature philosophy or worldview of something, which is one of the great things about the work. But it's tricky because at the same time, of course, you've got this figure who, like we say, is sort of deceiving himself. He's deceiving her, the object of his love. She's deceiving him. They're both, in a way, deceiving the reader, and everyone's sort of trying to sort of work out and read between the lines. But I think, in a way, the wonderful thing of being a reader of that is then through sort of signposting it or sort of connecting the dots, you can kind of actually work out that not everyone is saying exactly what they're thinking, and how you can sort of begin to disentangle all those elements and read different layers at different times. I mean, kind of in a way, the Cursed Bunny. I mean, a lot of the stories there can be read in so many different ways at the same time, which was another thing that I loved about them. But what was I going to say? There was one other thing point that you asked about that I was going to answer, and now it's completely gone out of my head. I remember what it was now. You were asking about the freshness, or the sort of seeming freshness of it, which is a really interesting question as well. So, yeah, because I mean, essentially, it was written in the late 1920s, published in 1930, but it is a work of autofiction, for want of a better word. I mean, there's so much. If you know Felsen's own biography, there's so much of that in there, and the narrator is really a sort of thinly veiled version of him, we're led to believe. But then that asks sort of interesting questions about how we interpret the character, because the narrator. Okay, there are a lot of things, if you're sort of very neurotic person like I am, there are a lot of things that I sort of personally sort of empathise with. But then at the same time, if you read it against contemporary culture, there is something very sort of almost incel-like about this guy who's sort of sitting there thinking like, oh my God, why won't this woman fall in love with me? Like, what's happening? Like, I hate this. So, I mean, there are so many different... There is a freshness, but I think in terms of the psychology, that's the sort of beauty of it. It's quite wonderful to be able to look back and think, actually, we as humans, there are some of these things that are eternal, and there's a sort of beauty in that in a way. But like, for all the sort of messiness and complicatedness of these things, they can be quite worthwhile reading. I think that's the sort of measure of a really good work. It retains that sort of freshness across time in a way.
Absolutely, across translation too. I think a work like this just works really well in translation. I mean, it's probably because you did such a great job, but it also, theoretically, like if I were a translator and I could read Russian and this had not been translated and I picked it up, I'd be like, oh, this would work really well in translation, because I don't know, I feel like some works lend themselves really well to translation and some don't. And it like just sometimes it just doesn't matter if an author is alive or dead. Like it's like for this work, I feel like translation just adds like an extra level of deceit to the deceit. I really love that. I also there was something really interesting you said in your translator's note for this book, where you said, we know that the author, like how the author dies. So we kind of know, like, we naturally superimpose that to the narrator, and who is quite a funny guy. But then we kind of like realize, oh, there's a reason why he's in exile, and it is very likely what's going to happen to him once the war catches up to what will happen in Paris. And so like that adds an extra layer. And so there are like these meta layers, like the more you read it, the more you realize, like, oh, there's so many just things that are interacting here, and not just what's on the page. It's already very complicated because, like you said, like at some point, someone is fooling someone. It could be the reader or the character, and you, as the translator, you have to have it all straight. I mean, the reader doesn't have to. The reader has the luxury of discovering, everything as they read it. But you, as a translator, like, you have to bring this out, put that in the background, and basically do what the writer is doing in order to kind of like time all the revelations and time everything. And I thought, like, and again, it's part of why I was like, wow, this is like this book really would lend itself well to translation, and it's precisely because of the contemporaneous that you talk about. How, I mean, I presume that this whole book was planned for publication before Russia invaded Ukraine, and now there are all these, now there's a whole new generation of Russian emigres who like that New Yorker article talked about, where they Russia's fleeing Russia because they don't want any part in the war. And so now we have that, which is now an extra layer on top of all the other layers that we discussed. Suddenly, it becomes like a very contemporary work. And like you said, that is absolutely the function of classical, of what makes a book classic, because it still speaks to, our contemporary era.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the interesting bit, I mean, it's so interesting that you pick up on the sort of the parallels that come across that are just added to it across time as well, because you're absolutely right. I love this idea of it being a book that works fundamentally well in translation, because I think you're right, and I think there are a couple of reasons for it, perhaps. I mean, no doubt there's more than that I can think of off the top of my head, but on the one hand, when you're coming from a place as an author, when you're already in this sort of exile or dislocation, there is something that's very fundamentally sort of, that lends itself to translation. There, the fact that you're having to translate yourself, as you said earlier. I think there are also because the language is so highly stylized as well. It's sort of kind of ripped away from that sort of Russian realia. It takes place in Paris. There's already this sort of mode of estrangement that's working within the novel that again lends itself inherently to that. And again, because the language is so artificial, when I was doing it, it just forces you as a translator. You really have to mould English in a way that you don't perhaps say writers who are a bit more straightforward or keep their prose a bit more simple, when the writers so heavily sort of aestheticizing their writing, in a way that lends itself to that sort of more international, I suppose, translation, that aspect. And it's interesting as well, you pick up on the sort of the horrible parallel with the situation and the Russia's war in Ukraine today. I mean, I think one of the interesting things for me when I was sort of becoming aware of Felsen is that here you have someone who he wrote three novels throughout the 30s. This was the very first of them, and they're all to do with these very tortured love stories, and the sort of it's actually they're all this same figure who goes throughout it all. And you kind of think to yourself, okay, so why? Here's someone who's been plucked out of their country because of the political reasons. They've had to flee their homeland. They're in exile. They're living in Europe in the 30s, where fascism's going rampant, where so many other really dark political turns are starting to happen. Yet here's someone who's writing about love again and again and again. And for quite a while, I wondered, why is he doing this? Because of course, all writing, for better or worse, is political in some respect. Even if you're not talking about something, that's still a political act, right? So, and then I finally came across an article, an interview that Felsen himself had done, I think in about 1936, where he said, actually, no, this is a political response to it, because when I look around and when everything is all for this sort of groupthink, for this sort of really sort of fascistic, he was equally critical of the communist regime as well, for this sort of anything that would deny the sort of individuality or his personal self, all this sense of identity. And he said, what more political thing can there be to write about love in that sort of context, which I think is and all the sort of neuroses that go with it, that's so inherently individual and so complicated. And I think actually, in a way, that is a really valid and really interesting political response to the time. Again, maybe that's another reason why it sort of carries over to today, perhaps.
Yeah, it's love. In Korean, I should explain, in Korean middle schools, because I had a very Korean public school education, public school in the American English sense, not the British English sense, because I had a very ordinary Korean education, in other words. And one of the things we learn about poetry from this era, because Korea was occupied by Japan, is that a lot of poets, when they would write these love poems about love, they're actually writing about the country and liberation. And so it's it's not a huge stretch to think that that you could argue that I can't pronounce her name. Sorry, the object of the narrator's affection, like
Loya. Yeah, Loya.
Loya. Oh, okay. Oh, it's so much simpler. It's so much simpler when you sound it out than you read on the page. Loya. Yeah, that's a lovely name. So that like Loya is a substitute for like his countryman maybe, or his country, or like it's very 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 easy to read political subtext into any of the characters and all of that. So yeah, I feel like that's an extremely political. The book is very very political, and it's not even like the most subtle politics that I've ever seen from. Right, I feel like it's very on the page.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.